History didn't begin the day before yesterday, and the intolerance of much of the world for Jewish life and culture, not to mention sovereignty over the ancient Jewish homeland, didn't start on October 7th or even in 1948. 2,000 years ago, Jews fought and lost 3 separate wars against Rome, the greatest power in the world at that time. There's so much about those conflicts that even those who claim to have some knowledge of Jewish history don't know or understand. And what lessons can we learn about modern statecraft as well as the fight to preserve Jewish life from those wars? This week on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the past as well as its implications for the present with historian Barry Strauss, one of the leading contemporary experts on the ancient world and the author of the new book, Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have a fascinating conversation for you with historian Barry Strauss, the author of Jews versus Rome. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, to today's program. Ours is an era when knowledge of history, something that was once considered absolutely essential to be an educated person, is at a low point. Not only has our educational system largely abandoned the teaching of history in favor of either specialized gender or minority studies, but much of what is taught now is a distortion of the past taught through the prism of left-wing myths about race, intersectionality, and settler colonialism. Even worse, a lot of what passes for an examination of the past today is merely the musings of internet frauds like Darryl Cooper, the anti-Semitic Holocaust denier made famous by his fanboy Tucker Carlson. But though you might struggle to know it if your only encounters with history is via your YouTube or TikTok feeds, real historians doing valuable work about the past that informs the present is still going on. More to the point, the need for serious examinations of the ancient world, as well as the more recent past, is greater than ever. And those who puzzle over the current dilemmas of the Middle East would do well to ponder the precedents, as well as the foreshadowing of today's conflicts. That is especially true with respect to the history of the land of Israel and what happened there 2,000 years ago, when the Jewish people engaged in epic, lopsided battles with the Roman Empire that still resonate today. That's why we're truly honored to have with us today one of the most important historians of the ancient world who has just published a new book about those wars. Barry Strauss is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor in humanistic studies emeritus at Cornell University and a leading expert on military history and the ancient world. His previous books include The War That Made the Roman Empire, The Battle of Salamis, The Trojan War, The Spartacus War, Masters of Command, The Death of Caesars, and 10 Caesars, as well as the new Jews versus Rome, 2 centuries of rebellion against the world's mightiest empire. Barry Strauss, welcome to Think Twice.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, Professor Strauss, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you about the connection between the topic of your new book and today's conflicts, which is the note on which you actually conclude
Yes.
Jews versus Rome.
Yeah.
Contemporary Jews draw a strong connection between the Jewish Commonwealth of 2,000 years ago and modern Israel, but there's obviously significant denial of this for political reasons from Palestinians, as well as American commentators who hate Israel, like Todd Nahisi Coates, just to pick one out of many. And there are even respected historians who think the identification with the Jews of the era of the 3 wars you write about is something of an anachronism. Tom Holland, who is one of the most widely read authors about the ancient world, stated explicitly in his most recent book, Pax, which covers the period that you also write about, but from a different point of view, that he thought it was a misnomer to call the people who fought in those conflicts Jews, and instead he just refers to them as Judeans. You don't do this in Jews versus Rome.
No.
Is this semantics or an important distinction? And how does this debate about the connection between the past and the present color our understanding of this period?
Sure. So, there is a debate among scholars as to whether to call the people of this period Jews or Judeans. I think it comes from a good place, from a well-meaning place. Tom Holland does do this, but he's not the person who originated it, which is no criticism of him. I think there is an attempt on the part of well-meaning Christian historians to want to say it's, we should not be blaming the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, because after all, it was Judeans, not Jews, who did that, as opposed to Galileans. I don't find that a particularly persuasive argument. There'd be another argument that would say, the term Jews carries a lot of baggage with it. And of course, these people were the ancestors of modern Jews, but it's more accurate to call them Judeans, which is what they thought of themselves. I don't find that a persuasive argument for two reasons. First of all, in Hebrew, the connection between Yehudim and Yehudaim is very, very close, much closer than Judeans and Jews in English. And secondly, to do this is to write Jews out of Jewish history. I mean, to act as if there weren't Jews in ancient times, which has all sorts of terrible political connotations. So I don't think it's accurate. I think it's largely well-meaning and maybe in some sense pedantic. But, as one scholar said more generally, there's no such thing as an innocent name in history. And I think that's true. So we have to be very careful about the names that we choose. And I discuss this a bit actually in a footnote, I think, in my book. I think it's a reasonable debate to have, but I think in the end, Jew is the appropriate word as opposed to Judean.
What was it about the political culture of the Jews of the Second Temple era and that of the Roman Empire that led to not just one conflict, but 3 apocalyptic wars over the course of less than 75 years? Was it that, it's like in your book and others, the Romans kind of thought the Jews were crazy. They even thought they were atheists because they didn't believe in many gods. They didn't understand the Jewish culture. They thought there was something nuts about them. And
Right.
the Jews obviously didn't really get Rome, or at least most of them didn't.
Right.
What led to this? What was it about this relationship that was obviously so toxic?
Okay. Great question. So a couple of things. First of all, from the Roman side, there was Roman misbehavior and mismanagement. Earlier on, when you get an emperor like Augustus, the first emperor, and in partnership with Herod, the king of the Jews, the famous and infamous Herod, and infamous and famous both for good reasons, you have a good relationship. The two of them are able to work things out. But afterwards, when the Romans pull the plug on the Jewish kings of Judea and make Judea a province, and when you get emperors who are not as wise and restrained as Augustus, when you get a Caligula or a Nero, Nero's attitude towards the Jews were, as you said, they were atheists. And his instructions to his governor was squeeze them until the pips squeak. And so the governor extorted money from the Jews, and he stole money from the temple, and he also ordered the massacre of civilians in Jerusalem. Later on, after the first revolt, the Romans imposed something unprecedented on the Jews, a tax on every Jew in the empire, simply by virtue of their being Jewish. And to add insult to injury, the tax was to be paid to the chief god of Rome, to Jupiter the Capitoline Hill, as if this were some kind of cruel parody of the tax that had been paid to the temple previously by Jews around the world. So you have Roman mismanagement and misbehavior. From the point of view of the Jews, there are 2 factors, or 3 really. First of all, Judea had been an independent state, and its independence had been incredibly hard-won and dramatic and even mythical in the famous revolt of the Maccabees. And only a century later, Judea loses its independence to Rome. There's hardly anyone in Judea who doesn't resent that and regret what happened. And then there are two factors that lead to rebellion. One is what you might call religious/ideological. This period is the golden age of apocalyptic and messianic thinking in the Jewish world and in what becomes the Christian world. That is the idea that the world as we know it is going to come to an end, that redemption is at hand, that the kingdom of God is at hand, that Israel will rise again over its opponents, that everyone will recognize the sovereignty of the God of Israel, and that all of this will be ushered in by a descendant of King David, by the King Messiah. And there are various different claimants to be Messiah in this period. This sort of belief does not encourage passive obedience to the Roman oppressor. On the other hand, there's a very pragmatic factor that would encourage people to rebellion, and that is that the Jews of Judea, or the Judeans if you prefer, are not alone. There is a large diaspora, probably outnumbering, in terms of population, the Jews of Judea, though we're not certain of that, stretching westward in the Roman Empire to Rome itself, and more importantly, stretching eastward into the Parthian Empire. The fact that there was a large, prosperous, militant Jewish community in the Parthian Empire, particularly in what is now Iraq, was a very important factor for the rebels. And strategically, they thought, we can get help from our brethren abroad, possibly even from the king of Parthia, and more likely from the dynasty ruling what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, Adiabene in ancient times. This was a dynasty that had converted to Judaism and that sent its sons to Jerusalem to be educated, that had built palaces in Jerusalem, and that indeed did send a small number of soldiers to fight in the Great Revolt against Rome. So I'd say Roman mismanagement on the one hand, on the other hand, on the part of the Jews themselves, both religious/ideological grounds to revolt and a nationalistic grounds to revolt, and a pragmatic thought, we can get help from abroad.
Right. Now, in your book, as you just laid out briefly, you tell us about the history of the century that preceded the Great Revolt and the revolts that followed. How did the Jews lose the independence that the Maccabees had won? And what was the role that Herod, whom you've already referenced, someone who looms very large in the Christian narrative, but was also a pivotal, though often little understood figure in Jewish history. What was his role in playing and trying to achieve a balance between Rome and its culture and that of the Jews? And why couldn't that have lasted?
Great questions. So as Josephus tells us, and Josephus is our main source for this period, a fascinating and problematic character in and of himself, the Jews invited the Romans in. The Romans had conquered neighboring Syria just at the time when there was a dynastic dispute, all but a civil war between two members of the Hasmonean dynasty, the dynasty founded by the Maccabees, and they were vying for power. They each go to the Roman general, Pompey the Great in Syria, and say, come and help me. And Pompey chooses the one who he thinks will be more pliant and more likely to be obedient to Rome. He invades Judea on the invitation of this guy, comes to Jerusalem, and then lays siege to the Temple Mount, where the other faction is in control. And it takes several months before Pompey can take the Temple Mount. He does. He takes it. He famously enters the Holy of Holies, to the horror of the Jewish population. And he establishes his guy in charge. He demotes him from king to tetrarch, which is something like local ruler. And he takes away some of the territory in Judea that the Maccabees had conquered, and unleashes some of the Greek cities, because there are many cities in Judea where the population is mostly Greek-speaking. Probably many of them are Syrians and not Jewish, and he makes them independent. And he cuts off Judea's access to the sea. So it is a harsh settlement. The faction that loses turns to the Parthians, to the ancient Iranian Empire. And about 25 years later, when Rome is weak in the turmoil following the assassination of Julius Caesar, they call in the Parthians, and the Parthians invade. They conquer Syria, they conquer part of Asia Minor, and they conquer Judea and put their guy on the throne. So now Judea has gone from being a Roman dependency to being a Parthian dependency. Enter Herod. His family, his father in particular, had been close to the Romans. Herod escapes from Judea. He makes his way to Rome, and he makes his case that I'm your guy. And the Romans, the Senate declares him king of Judea. Hard to believe the king of the Jews is anointed, as it were, by the Roman Senate. And Herod makes his way back to Judea, where it takes him the next 3 years to fight the opposition to him becoming king and to fight the return of the Romans. He has intermittent help from Roman legions. And in the end, it's those legions who allow him to conquer Jerusalem and make Judea his own. And so we're now in the year 37 BCE. From 37 BCE to 4 BCE, Herod is the king of Judea. And he is, although he rules with an iron fist, he's a very clever strategist. And he works closely with the leading Romans, first with Mark Antony, and then without missing a beat, he switches to Octavian, the future Augustus, after Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra. And he promises them he's going to be the guy who's going to keep Rome in charge of this province. He's going to keep the Parthians out. He's going to keep the Romans in. And he will keep the peace between Jews and Greeks in Judea. He does this in a variety of ways. First of all, he builds 3 temples to Augustus, one in this magnificent new port he builds on the Mediterranean, Caesarea Maritima, Caesar's city by the sea. Another one in another new city he builds in Samaria called Sebaste, which means Augusta in Greek. And then third, he builds a huge, magnificent temple all the way near the foot of Mount Hermon in the north on the road to Damascus. So that's the way he says to the Romans, I'm your guy. You know, I am going to make it clear that this is a Roman province, a Roman friend, a Roman ally. But the other thing he does is he gratifies his Jewish subjects by rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple, on a magnificent scale such as had never known. In fact, he builds Jerusalem up to its greatest period of prosperity until the 20th century. And people notice, as you know, the Talmud says that if you'd never seen Herod's temple, you'd never seen a beautiful building. It really becomes one of the great pilgrimage sites, one of the great shrines of the ancient world. He would have loved dearly to be able to have people worshiping Augustus as emperor in the temple in Jerusalem, but he knew that he could never get away with that. So what he does is the next best thing. He has the temple make daily sacrifices on behalf of the Roman emperor, and he gets Augustus to pay for those sacrifices, to sponsor them. So it's really a close relationship between Augustus and Herod, and he does other things throughout the eastern part of the Roman Empire to make himself indispensable to Augustus. One of my favorite, well, he becomes the patron of the Olympic Games, and he actually goes to the Olympic Games. He is a great advocate of Greek culture. His name, Herod, is Greek. It's from the word that we get hero from. And he plays a big role in building the new city that Augustus builds at the site of the Battle of Actium, Nicopolis, Victory City. So he is really a very, very ambitious man with a big strategic vision.
Yeah. Now, the question that the readers of this book must ask, and one that you also address, is how inevitable were these conflicts? The Romans had different policies for the various peoples and lands they ruled and occupied. Were the provocations that you've already, you referenced before that led to the Jews revolting an inevitable result of their dominion of what is now Israel, assuming that anything in history is inevitable? And how could the Jews have managed things so as to preserve their way of life without going to war and ultimately seeing the destruction of everything they valued, including the temple. I mean,
Yeah,
was that possible?
that is the great question. Was it possible? I guess I think, it depends what day of the week you ask me and what mood I'm in. I think it was barely possible if you had really restrained politicians on both sides. If, for example, you had the kind of leaders leading Rome and leading Judea that you had in the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which is to say, there are some lines we won't cross because we know it would lead to mutually assured destruction. I think in a way you had that with Augustus and Herod. It's asking a lot of human beings to think that this would continue this way. And I can't say that I'm surprised that it didn't continue this way. There are so many grounds for friction, so many grounds of friction between these two sides, that if the conflict wasn't inevitable, nobody could say they were surprised when a conflict ultimately broke out. I mean, for the conflict not to happen, the Jews would have to accept the legal fiction that the capital of Judea was Caesarea, where the Roman governor sat. And the Romans would have to accept the legal fiction that the capital of Judea was Jerusalem, and above all, the house of God, the temple on the Temple Mount. Both sides would have to continue to be restrained and accept this. And the Romans are constantly pushing. Under Caligula, more accurately known as Gaius, he insists that a statue of him be erected in the temple. And that is in retaliation after there was a Greek provocation to put up an altar that offended the Jews, and the Jews knocked down the altar, and that offended Caligula, the emperor, and then he said he wants a statue to be put up. There's almost a revolt then, except at the last minute, Caligula is assassinated, completely different reasons, and the situation calms down again. So there's so many points of friction. I wish I could say the revolt wasn't inevitable, but probably it would have happened at one point or another.
Yeah. Now, once it does happen, it's an unequal struggle, obviously, but the Jews do hold out in Rome. They have the advantage because Rome has a civil war right at the time, the year of the four emperors, right at the time that the Great Revolt is taking place. It kind of puts that war on hold for a couple of years,
yes,
as you write. But once the Romans finally get around, getting around to finishing off the Jews, for 2,000 years, Jews are taught that the reason for the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem was sinat chinam, or the baseless hatred that the various factions of the Jews had for each other. On one foot, as we say, what were those divisions, and why did it turn out to be impossible until it was too late for them to be overcome, given the fact that they could see right in front of them that the sort of unity was their only hope, if they had any hope at all?
Right. Yeah. Well, the divisions, to say them on one foot, on the one hand, you had the Zealots, who were a priestly faction, relatively moderate revolutionaries as this thing goes. Then you had more radicals, the Sicarii, or the Daggermen. They're descended from a family of rebels from the north. They are at violent odds with the Zealots, and after they assassinate a Zealot leader, they're driven out of Jerusalem, and they spend the war at Masada. Within Jerusalem, you have a group that comes from the north, led by a man named John from Giskala, Gushchalav in Hebrew, and he has his faction, his supporters. And then you have another group led by a man named Simon Bar Kochba. Probably, it certainly comes from a family of converts, and he is the most radical politically. He cares about the poor. He may want to free slaves. He is opposed to the elite. And he gets the support of the Idumeans. These are a group of people in what's now central/southern Israel. Originally migrated from Edom in Jordan. They had converted to Judaism in the 2nd century BCE. They supported Simon. And so all these groups are fighting each other and killing each other in Jerusalem particularly during this period you alluded to when the Romans are busy with their own civil war, a period of relative peace, and they even end up burning the grain supply, a truly suicidal gesture. It is indeed sinat hinam. Why do they behave in this way? That is a really good question. How could they not see the bigger picture? I think it is in part because they felt invulnerable behind the walls of Jerusalem, in part because they thought they had the leisure to get it right, to get the right group leading this revolt for the time when the Romans came. When the Romans did start their siege, these groups engaged in relative unity. They were relatively unified, but it was too late at that point to succeed. Also, it's no way to encourage the Parthians. If your strategic goal is to get the Parthians, you want to show that you are a strong horse that the Parthians can bet on. But if the Parthians can see that you're falling apart, well, that's not a way to get outside help.
Right. Now, is there any realistic scenario in which the Great Revolt could have been a success rather than a colossal blunder in which a tiny people with no real army could have withstood the might of, as your book terms it, the world's mightiest empire? What were the factors that led the Jews to think that it was a good idea? And what role did Parthia, a kingdom, as you said, but we're now in Iraq and Iran, play in this thinking?
Yeah.
And, given the fact that the Romans and the Parthians are at each other throughout this entire period, and with the Parthians often getting the best of the Romans in this period, that might have, when you look at it from that point of view, it's serious. Why didn't the Parthians use the Great Revolt to get a leg up on the Romans with whom they were always fighting anyway?
Sure. So it's a great question. The Great Revolt begins in the year 66. In the year 63, the Parthians won a great victory over the Romans and got the Romans to accept the fact that the Parthian dynasty put one of the members of the dynasty on the throne of Armenia, which was a bigger country in antiquity than it is today, very important strategically. The Romans played this as a success because the king of Armenia went to Rome and he genuflected in front of the emperor. But in fact, it was a strategic defeat and everybody knew it. So if I'm a potential rebel 3 years later, I'm looking at Jewish rebel, I'm looking around and saying, the Parthians can help us. And the Parthians have a leg up over the Romans. Nero had faced revolts in the West, and Nero was a bit shaky on the throne. Another reason to think, gee, this might be a good time to revolt. So I don't think it's completely crazy for the rebels to think this, and it's fueled by this religious fervor that will get people to support them in the rebellion. Also, Jerusalem is extremely well fortified. It's one of the best fortified cities in the ancient world. So if you're a rebel and you think the Romans are going to kill my people, they're massacring civilians in Judea, little by little they're taking from the temple, and Jewish collaborators are going to make sure that the Romans have their way with us, which ultimately will lead to the demise of the temple. This is the time to strike, and I bet we can get the Parthians to help us. Now, if you're a Parthian, you're going to say, prove it. Prove to me that this is a rebellion worth fighting. Just as the French at the time of the American Revolution, they didn't jump in until the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga. We're interested, they said, but prove it that you're not really going to patch things up with the king. The rebels, unfortunately, never are able to offer that proof to the Parthians. The Parthians have a lot of other issues to deal with. They have a new empire in the east that's threatening them. They have barbarians to the north that's threatening them. They now have a good relationship with the Romans. They're not going to risk anything until they think it's really worth doing.
That's a great point. The Jews lacked their Saratoga, and indeed, they probably never had a chance to have one. Well, the reason why we know so much about this era is the historian Josephus, known to Josephus. He had a Hebrew name before that.
Yes.
Who was a Jew who played a lot of different roles over the course of his life. He was a rebel. He was a Roman appeaser, then a rebel. Then he turns his coat and joins the Romans. He's a major part of your narrative, who is both essential and, as you repeatedly write, someone whose work should often be taken with a shovel full of salt.
Yes.
What should we think about him now?
Well, First of all, I should say that Josephus, in switching sides repeatedly, Josephus is not unique. There are other men and women on the Roman frontier and other places who do something very similar. That's the way the Roman Empire works. It's attractive to people, and it switches, and they switch as well. So Josephus is a traitor, but he's not unique in his behavior. He's someone who we must have, I think, two opinions about. Well, he's a traitor. There's no way to put a nice face on it. But he devotes the rest of his life in Rome to justifying the Jewish people. And he writes these series of books, which are great books. They are literary works. They're very problematic from the historical point of view, because one aspect of them is to make himself look good, which he does to the point that he tells contradictory stories about his behavior in different books. The other thing is he inflates statistics, as ancient authors often do, to make the Romans look good. But in these books, he wants to do two things. First, he wants to give a message to the Romans. The Jews are loyal subjects. It's only a few bad apples who cause this revolt. And don't worry, by and large, we're loyal Romans and we want to be good citizens. The other audience he addresses is the Jewish audience, and he wants to say to them, don't do it again. The Romans are brutes. They will stop at nothing. You don't dare lift a finger against the Romans. Accept their rule. That's the way it is. So those are the two agendas in his book. And I think the fact that he is working very hard to try to justify the Jewish people and to say to his Gentile readers, the Jews are a great nation, really one of the great nations of history. I think that should lead us to have some respect for Josephus and maybe forgive him for some other aspects of his life that we don't think so highly of.
Yeah. Now, you rightly said, you do point out there are other people who are on both sides of this, of this great conflict. One of them was, one of the aides to Vespasian and Titus, the Romans, who was Jewish. And on the other hand, we have people who were not Jewish, like Queen Helena of Adiabene, who, is a Parthian dependency, who converts to Judaism, as you said, that they were seduced by Judaism, or, how fluid was it to go between, the Jewish world and the Roman world? Is this an era where people could really, be Jews by choice as well as opt out of a Jewish identity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's much discussed by scholars. I think that for a royal family like the royal family of Adiabene to convert to Judaism is unusual, if not unique. But we know that there are non-Jews in the Roman world who are attracted to Judaism and who hang out at synagogues without going all the way to conversion, whatever conversion means in this period. And that in itself is a controversial question. They are referred to sometimes as God-fearers. God-fearers. They're attracted to Judaism. There's a lot about Judaism that they like, but they don't go all the way to become Jews. And I think your question is a really insightful one. These boundaries are quite fluid. Conversion maybe not so fluid, but moving back and forth between these different worlds, the Roman world and the Jewish world, is very common, especially in the diaspora. Less so in Judea, but in the diaspora, it is more common. And even Judea, it's not unusual. I mean, look at Herod. Herod comes from a family of Idumean converts on his father's side. His mother is an Arab, and he himself is devoted to Greek culture, while also building the temple to its greatest height in the ancient world. So you do get these figures who go back and forth.
Right. So why were there more revolts after the destruction of Jerusalem and then the conquest of Masada? The story continues. And in particular, why a revolt of the Jewish diaspora against Rome in what is now Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus, some decades after the fall of Jerusalem? On its face, that seems an even worse misjudgment than the Great Revolt. Kind of crazy. Was this merely the consequence of persecution, or was it as the Romans seem to think, a function of the basic incompatibility of Jews with the culture and governance of the Roman world.
I wouldn't put it really quite either ways. I mean, again, my idea is that the Parthians did it. So in the year 115, the Roman Emperor Trajan decides to invade the Parthian Empire. This had long been a goal that the various Romans had talked about. Trajan decides to do something about it. He invades the Parthian Empire. He conquers Armenia and Iraq and goes all the way to the Persian Gulf. And he's hailed as Parthicus, the conqueror of Parthia. But then, oops, the next year there's an insurgency in Iraq. I know a familiar scenario. And among the leaders of the insurgents are the Jews in Mesopotamia. And Trajan instructs his generals to particularly fight these Jews who are leading the insurgency. So the same time, in the year 116, the Diaspora revolt begins in Libya and Egypt and spreads to Cyprus. Now, we know very little about this revolt. It's extremely poorly documented. There's no Josephus, and there's not even as much information as we have about Bar Kochba. But what we have is intriguing. And to me, the timing is irresistible. It's very hard for me to imagine that these rebels have no idea that there's a war going on in Parthia and that the Romans are extended there. And it's very hard for me to believe that there aren't messengers from Parthia coming and saying, Jews, if you want to get rid of the Romans, now is the time to act. So why would the Jews of Egypt, Cyprus, and Libya want to get rid of the Romans? I think it's partly because some of the same people who had led the Great Revolt had fled there, and they had some of the same ideas. But also this Jewish tax, the fiscus Judaicus, is so insulting, humiliating, and also harmful that it allows, let's call them radicals, to seize the day. I have no doubt that there were many Jews in those provinces who said, don't be crazy. Don't rebel against the Romans. We're doing okay. Just leave things alone. But there were people who were inspired to revolt, who won the day, and who could have said, and this is our moment. We'll never have a moment this good again. The Parthians, and our brethren in particular, are pushing back against the Romans. The Romans are overextended. Now is the time to move. And they force the Romans to take troops from Parthia and send them westward to suppress these revolts, which, alas, the Romans do with great efficiency, engaging in real massacres of the Jewish population in these areas, and to a large extent wiping out what had been three very large and prosperous diaspora communities. So it ends up being a disaster for the Jews. But it's great for Parthia because the Romans are defeated in Parthia. They are forced to give up their invasion. Trajan wants to fight again, but he has a stroke and dies. And his successor, Hadrian, says, that's it, I'm pulling the plug. And in order to do so and give up the war in Libya, he has to order the assassination of 4 of Rome's best generals who aren't on board with suppressing this revolt.
Well, that's a lot, but interesting. And something that's a subject I think even people who have, some good knowledge of Jewish history often know nothing about. Now, the last of the 3 revolts is what we know as the Bar Kochba revolt, 70 years after the Great Revolt. Jewish tradition, which is clearly ambivalent about the idea of someone assuming the title of Messiah, as Bar Kochba did, even though Rabbi Akiva, gives his, koshers it. But it's, Jewish tradition also still speaks of him with admiration about the heroism of those who joined him. And the persecutions of the Jews in this era under the Emperor Hadrian are, still part of the modern liturgy of Yom Kippur.
Absolutely.
I think the question that intrigues me is sort of what comes first? Is it that the persecutions of Hadrian, the Hadrianic persecutions, provoked the last rebellion? Or were they the Roman backlash against it in an attempt to, finally solve what they would have called their version of the Jewish problem?
Yes, that's a great question. And thanks to archaeology, we can answer it in a way that we were never able to do before. Again, our sources for the Bar Kochba revolt are extremely limited. Um, but this is the picture we used to have. In the year, Hadrian becomes emperor in 117, so that's at the end of the Diaspora revolt, and pulls out of Parthia. In the year 130, so 13 years later, he comes to Jerusalem and announces the ruins of Jerusalem. He announces, we're going to rebuild the city. That's the good news, Jews. The bad news is it's going to be a pagan city. There's going to be nothing Jewish about it. We now know through archaeology that this project begins right away. As soon as he gets on the throne in 117, they're starting the renovation of the city and building the new city. To my mind, this creates a different picture. First of all, to the Jews, it becomes very clear what the Romans are going to do, and that they're not going to rebuild the temple. They're going to desecrate their holy city by making it a pagan city. But it also gives Hadrian a motive for why he does this. He does this because Rome has been humiliated in Parthia, and the Jews have played a central role in that humiliation. So by rebuilding Jerusalem as a pagan city, Hadrian kills two birds with one stone. He says to the Jews, don't even think about rebelling again, because look what we're going to do to you. And he says to the Parthians, Rome is not giving up in the Near East, and Rome is, we're still here. In fact, we're coming back stronger than ever. I don't make wars, but I build stuff like Hadrian's Wall, most famously in England. Here, I'm building this new Roman city where Jerusalem was. So don't even think about pushing further after this victory that you've won. I think that's why he does it. That's, a total declaration of war to Jewish nationalists. There's some evidence that he also bans circumcision at this time, before the revolt breaks out. The evidence comes from a Christian source, but it's quite reasonable evidence. And my colleague, Professor Schwartz in Jerusalem, I think makes a strong case that circumcision was banned before the Bar Kochba revolt. So on the one hand, it's the Romans, as you say, trying to solve what they saw as their Jewish problem. And on the other hand, it's Jewish patriots, nationalists, responding to this by saying, we have to fight this. And maybe the Parthians will come in. Look how strong the Parthians are vis-a-vis the Romans, given recent history.
Now, if I could just drill down a little bit more on that. One sort of clue about this era is in the Passover Seder, where, the part where we read about, the rabbis, including Rabbi Akiva,
Yes.
Studying through the night and with students, waiting outside, acting what seems to be like, lookouts. Again, is that something that happened after Bar Kochba, or is it what led to Bar Kochba? Or do we have really no idea?
We don't know. I think the safe answer is it happened after Bar Kochba in response to the revolt. But as I said, there's so much hostility of Hadrian towards the Jews before that it would not be surprising if it happened before the revolt. Certainly, it is the atmosphere, the fervid atmosphere of this period. I mean, put yourself in Hadrian's shoes, and you're going to say, this has been a disaster for Rome. Why was it a disaster? Maybe it was hubris on the part of Trajan. Unlikely that Hadrian was in favor of the revolt in the first place. But it's also because the Jews fought against us, both in Mesopotamia and in the rear. So if you're Hadrian, you might think, well, gee, I do have a Jewish problem, and I got to do something. It might have been reconciling with the Jews. It might have been that he said, we're going to get rid of this awful tax on the Jews, which the Romans don't. It continues for centuries. But instead, he takes a hard line, a line of persecution.
Yeah. Well, for the Romans, were the Jews like the Black Knight in Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Like the guy that just won't give up. He cut off his arms and his legs, and he says, "I'll bite you on the knee." Is that how they view is that their view of the Jews, as these crazy warlike people, complete opposite of the image of Jews in throughout the millennia to follow? Is that who they thought the Jews were?
Not quite. They thought they were warlike, and they thought they were crazy in the sense that they didn't recognize the gods, but they thought they were dangerous. I mean, Rome takes the Parthian threat seriously. And here are these guys, they're all over the Roman Empire, and they're friendly to Parthia. They're supporting Parthia, in effect. They're making a contribution in kind to the Parthian war effort against Rome. So it's not that they're sort of cute, crazy like the Black Knight. It's like they're dangerous. That's from the Roman point of view. And the Romans are not famous when facing danger by saying, we'll make nice to you.
No, that was not how they conquered the world. No.
It's not how they conquered the world. So, the Jews are playing with fire, and they get burned.
Yeah. Now, one of, I think, the snares for anybody who studies history is to try to read too many lessons into the past to guide the present. But it's inevitable that we look at these conflicts that you've studied and say, what does this mean for Jews today, for the state of Israel today, which as you conclude the book, it's like, the refusal to recognize, the permanency or the legitimacy of the Jewish presence in their land is not a new theme.
It's not a new theme.
Other than, don't pick fights against world powers when you don't have, the wherewithal to do it. What are the lessons from these revolts for us today?
Okay, so one question is the danger of disunity. This is a danger for every society, for the United States, I might say, as well as for Israel. But certainly from Jewish history, one of the lessons of these revolts is disunity is fatal. Sure, there are some Jews who are saying don't revolt in the first place, but that's not the disunity that was particularly fatal. It's the disunity within the walls of Jerusalem that's absolutely fatal. And I think there should be a lesson that you can only take political dispute during time of war or in a dangerous period, and I'm afraid it's always a dangerous period for Israel. You can only take it so far. There are many Israelis who cited this during the war after October 7th. But I was in Israel in the spring of 2023 before October 7th, and people were saying it then. Many Israelis were saying it then. So disunity is an issue. The second issue I would say is the relationship between faith and politics. I mean, faith is essential for Jews and for everyone in their own particular way. But when you are letting it lead you to politically dangerous, unintelligent decisions, then you have to really think things through and you have to be careful of what you're doing. Another lesson is that small states never are fully independent. In fact, even large states are never fully independent. Everyone needs allies, but small states above all need allies. And so I think Israel today must learn from the lesson of the failure of the rebels in the Great Revolts. They had a plan that was an intelligent plan, getting help from Parthia. But they should have been able to do a cost-benefit analysis and say, it's not likely, and maybe back down then. But let me just take a step back and say there's one other issue. This is kind of a cosmic issue. What would have happened if there had never been Jewish revolts, if there'd never been these rebellions? Well, one answer people would say is everything would have been great. The Jews would never been exiled from their homeland. The temple would have continued and would have just chugged along. But there's another possibility, and that is that little by little, the allure of the Roman Empire would have eaten away at any idea of Jewish nationhood. What you ultimately would have gotten is the Jews would have become like the Phoenicians. Where are the Phoenicians today? There are people who are genetically descended from Phoenicians, but there is no Phoenician culture. Would Jewish culture have continued if there had never been a revolt and if the Romans had simply little by little taken over the Holy Land? The answer is, I don't know, but I don't think it's a safe bet that it would have. And there is an argument that says the rebellions were terrible. They were absolutely terrible. But they led to the resilience of the rabbis. They led to the rabbinic movement and to a resilience that has allowed the Jewish people to survive. Now, many historians would disagree with that, and it has to be speculative. But I don't think it's a straight line to say no revolts, everything would have been great. It could have had a very, very, very different outcome.
Yeah, well, the counterfactuals are endless because
Yeah.
if you assume that there's no revolt and the Jews sort of make their way in through the next couple of centuries still intact in their land, something else terrible could have happened.
Precisely.
We have
Yeah.
no idea what that would have been. Now, finally, I want to ask you your thoughts about the current state of the study of history, going a little bit afield from what we've been discussing. We're in an era where, just to take one example, a podcaster, a Holocaust denier, an anti-Semite like Darryl Cooper can be hailed by some prominent voices as a great historian. And when the teaching of history in our schools in this country has to some extent been largely abandoned
Yeah.
in favor of, gender studies and toxic myths about race and settler colonialism. So ignorance and cynical revisionism is often the rule for most Americans when it comes to their knowledge of the past. How important is it for people to read, more actual historical work in order to understand our world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a terrible situation. Education, the American educational system from K through 12 all the way through the universities is in trouble. It has, there's a very large part of it in the hands of the so-called progressives, the so-called woke people, and they are selling narratives that give a completely different view of American history, a completely different view of the world, and that make it easier for people to push the button of the oldest hatred and to cast the Jews as the villains. Now, it's not a completely either-or situation. There's still many good people in the educational system, many good teachers and many good professors at universities. But the other side is way too strong, and it's quite unbalanced. So I think it's absolutely essential for the next generation for good people to get control or get a large part of the educational system and to bring us back to a sensible educational system in which people can study history without fear or favor in an unbiased way, not giving just one view of the world. I think we know as citizens, we know as Jews, even whether we're Jewish or not, we know that education is absolutely essential. So this is something that we have to prioritize.
Yes, that's an important note to end on. Professor Strauss, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And, to our audience, whether you're just a history buff or someone who understands that a lot of our present dilemmas have echoes in the past, I heartily recommend Jews versus Rome. Like all of your books, it's a great read. Can you tell us how our viewers and listeners can follow your work and where your books are available?
Sure. I have a website. That's very simple, barrystrauss.com. You can follow my work there. And my books are available pretty much wherever books are sold. There are links on the website to buying the book. You can go to Amazon. You can go to your favorite bookstore. You'll find them all over the place. So thank you very much for your interest in them.
Well, thank you. And we also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org. Subscribe to our newsletters and also tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us there, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again next week.